Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This video is going to be similar to some other videos I've done. I used to call what I'm going to show you guys Kokedama, but in reality it's not completely an accurate example of a Kokedama. What I do, Kokedama is usually you take a plant, you take the root ball, you surround it with some soil and some clay. You surround that with some moss, like sphagnum moss. Then you bind it together with twine, and then on the outside of the root ball, you put living moss. So it has like this living moss root ball and this plant growing out of it. It's Japanese practice. What I do is I simply use sphagnum moss, and I have had some success in a lot of the tricky plants. And I say tricky only because my growing environment tends to be tricky when it comes to soils and things like that because I get a lot of root rot, and sometimes there's some fungus on top of the soil. So I'm constantly letting things dry out and then they start to wilt. So I've been forced to explore alternative methods of growing. So a moss wrap is definitely something that has helped a lot of my troublesome plants. So I'm going to show you just a few of the plants that I currently have in the moss wraps, and some others I will explain that I've had in the past that I may not have anymore, but they did very well. So first up is Coleus. Here we go. Everybody knows I love Coleus. I took this Coleus plant. This was one I had gotten from a nursery, and I took all the soil off the roots, and I surrounded it with some sphagnum moss and bound it with some yarn. You could see the roots are growing out nicely out of the bottom. So this plant has been in here probably since June or July, and now it's November. I've taken cuttings. You can see in the middle where those cuts were taken, and some new growth has happened. But look at how big this plant is. This plant has really grown. I got to take more cuttings because it's getting a little unruly. But all I do is I wait for this particular plant to kind of wilt a little. Coleus can easily succumb to root rot, so I wait for them to tell me, oh, I'm a little thirsty, by the leaves wilting just a little bit. I don't wait for it to totally faint. I just want it to wilt a little bit. And then I will give it some water. You fill up some water into the receptacle, whatever it is that you have the plant in. And when it's done absorbing, I'd say maybe after a minute, I wouldn't go too much longer because it'll get waterlogged. You dump out the rest of the water. And then this plant goes until the next week. They do really well, apparently. I got to take some more cuttings. So Coleus, moss wrap, really well. Next up, we have Hoya. Beautiful, beautiful Hoya. So this plant does extremely well. Being an epiphyte, they enjoy the wet-dry cycle. So the moss wrap gives a very nice wet-dry cycle, as long as you don't continue to water the root ball. So take the cutting. This originally was a cutting. Take the cutting, you just wrap it with some damp moss, bind it with some yarn or twine or whatever it is you want, and wait for that damp moss to dry up a little bit. And then you fill up your glass with a little bit of water, and after about a minute, you pour out the rest of the water, and that root ball, the moss wrap, will be nice and moist, and the plant will soak up as much moisture as it needs. Now, in order to know when the next time to water should be, is you can lift the plant up. I can't do it with one hand, but you lift it up out of the cup or out of the glass, and if it's very light and you can lift it up very easily, you know that it's dry and it can use a drink. Hoya don't always wilt like other plants do, like say Coleus. So you won't be able to see the plant is wilting. I mean, they're I guess semi-succulent plants, so these firm leaves won't really wilt. They may start to wrinkle, but what I've noticed is if they're starting to wrinkle, it may be a little bit too late, and you could have some die off in the stem. So I'd rather just wait to feel how light the root ball is, and then I will water it after about a minute, no longer than a minute. Pour out the rest of the water, and then you're good for a week or two. Hoya does really well. Next up, we have aroids. The example I have here is a very messy, unruly satin pothos. So this one I have to cut up a little bit, take some cuttings, and clean it up because it's a little messy. But only because it's growing so well. Doesn't have a lot of light, so that's why it's a little bit leggy at the moment. Same sort of situation. This was like 3 or 4 cuttings that I had taken off a mother plant. I bound them, no roots, I bound them together with the sphagnum moss, damp sphagnum, and wrapped, secured it with the yarn once again. And within, oh God, I don't know, it wasn't very long, but I started to see root growth. Sometimes coming out of the bottom, sometimes underneath the yarn, you could see it on the side. But either way, Pothos do extremely well in moss wraps. I also have put golden pothos, jade pothos, pearls and jade, all of the ornamental pothos that you see on the market, I have tried. And it's all the same result. They all do really well. So aroids, even philodendron, Hartley philodendron I've had wrapped in moss do really well. So aroids, good choice. Next up we have succulents. Now, this is an aloe hybrid right here. So I do a lot of aloe in moss wraps, but I also do Haworthia. I even have done some jade. I like to experiment. So a lot of different succulents do extremely well because, as you probably know, succulents like to dry out. They like that wet dry cycle. So this is like a perfect environment. They get a nice drink when you soak the root ball, pour out the rest, and it'll dry up when it's done. And once it's completely dry, again, you can lift it and feel how light that root ball is. Then you know you can water it again. This particular aloe hybrid, I have a few of them that are wrapped up in moss, and they've gone like a month, month and a half without any water. And they don't even look thirsty. The way you'll know that the plant is really starting to struggle is the leaves get really thin and curly, and they sometimes turn a reddish brown. But they can go a very long time off of their own reserves. So if you forget to water them, totally fine. They'll forgive you. One thing I have noticed is if you do consistently water and let them dry, of course, these plants, these aloe, grow extremely fast, and they'll start to climb over the glass and look like a creature. It's very cool. So that's that aloe. Here is another aloe. This is the aloe vera that everybody knows. It's not doing so well as far as these outer leaves. I got to pull them off. They got bent by being in this cup, but the rest of the plant, as you can see, is extremely healthy. This one has been wrapped in moss for maybe a year, a little over a year, and I forget about it from time to time, but you can see it's doing really well. It's nice and compact because it's been near a window, so it gets nice light, but it thrives on neglect. Again, these outer leaves, the old leaves, I can pull them off. You could probably use them for cuts and stuff like that. But anyway, aloe vera. One interesting thing, though, that I've learned in doing this, because I've wrapped aloe vera numerous times in moss, and I've had some casualties, I'm not going to lie to you. It's all a learning experience. What I've realized is when you get an aloe plant, obviously it's going to be in soil for the most part, unless you get it as a cutting. And one thing that you have to make sure you do is when you take the soil off of the roots, clean it really, 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 really well. Clean all the soil off the roots. I definitely recommend pulling off the smaller roots and leave the thicker main roots, because those smaller roots are going to dry up anyway when you're doing what I'm about to tell you. So you clean off the roots really, really well. Let the roots, the entire plant, sit out and dry for, I'd say, a couple of days, maybe even a week. You want those roots to callus over, just like you need to do for any cuttings of a succulent. You let the cut dry over and callus over, and this way it will prevent any type of infection or root rot to get in there, or stem rot if it's a cutting. So I let the roots dry out, and again, I only leave the main roots. I take all those little fine roots off because they're just going to dry up anyway, and set it out to dry. After a few days to a week, it's then ready to wrap up in the moss, and you just wrap it with moss and then bind it with either yarn like I've done. You could do string, you could do thread, you could do twine, whatever it is you want. And the same schedule applies to these guys. You let them, you water them, you let them dry completely. This one is very light, so it needs to be watered. It's not showing signs of dehydration. You can see all of these new leaves are nice and supple, so it's not struggling in any way. But I'm going to give it some water just because I want this plant to grow a little quicker. Again, quicker wet dry cycles, more frequent, gives faster growth with moss wraps from what I've experienced. Again, just my experience. So that's aloe vera wrapped in moss. Definitely much better for me because every aloe that I've kept in soil, I'd say every single one has eventually died, and it's died from root and stem rot. This one, over a year, and I have others that are just as old, if not older, that are wrapped in the moss, and they're thriving, and they're showing no signs of any illness or any rot of any kind. So I love it, especially if you're just going to be growing aloe vera in the house. I mean, I definitely recommend at least experimenting with a moss wrap. Again, wet dry cycles. Let them dry completely. Once they're dry, you can keep them dry for like another week. Like I said before, like a month of no watering an aloe wrapped in moss, totally fine. They have enough reserves that they don't need to be watered that often. But as long as you let the root ball dry, you can water it more frequently. As soon as it's dry, it'll grow quicker. But you don't have to. If you just want a pretty plant that looks really unique in an unusual setup, I recommend it. Okay, last but not least, we have what used to be Sansevieria trifasciata, which is now in Dracaena, I believe, the snake plant. Now, snake plants do not need a lot of soil. So, as you can see, there isn't very much moss here. I had taken these plants, or really it was just like 2 plants, I think, at first, and let the roots dry up really well, wrapped it in moss, bound it by yarn, and watered it, let it dry, forgot about it, watered it, and let it dry. Same situation. And you can see, excuse me, it's starting to grow pups. So I got a new pup there. There are a couple of them popping up in different areas. The plant is thriving. This one, it's a little bit dehydrated. You can see the leaves are a little bit wrinkly because I have not been watering this one enough. I think the last time I watered this may have been 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago. Plant's still alive, but that's not fair. I should water it. It's obviously a little thirsty. So same situation as you would with the other succulent, semi-succulent plants. Let that root ball dry before you water again. The only differences, the only plants that are different that you would treat differently are the aroids, because you don't want to wait for the entire thing to dry up, because these plants don't have as much reserve as succulents or snake plants. And the Coleus. This one will start to faint a little, start to wilt a little when it needs some water. That's your sign to make sure that you water it. But again, don't leave any standing water in the bottom. Pour out the rest of the water, and then your plant is good to go. So if you have any questions on my experimentation with this, any other plants I may have put into moss wraps that I haven't mentioned in this video, just leave a comment and I'll get back to you. I love talking plants, as you know. If you haven't subscribed, why not? Go for it. We talk about a lot of fun stuff here and we experiment. And if there's an experiment that you want me to do, I can always do that too. As long as I have access to the plant and the materials, I can do it. So share with your friends. Give a thumbs up if you liked it. Hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I upload. And I will see you in the next video.